part 1, we met Frank Abagnale Jr., a boy from New Rochelle who ran from a broken home at 16 and remade himself into something extraordinary. A fake Pan Am pilot who deadheaded across America and Europe on an airline's dime. A fake doctor who supervised real medical residents for nearly a year without losing a single patient. A man who passed the Louisiana bar examination on his second attempt without ever attending law school. By 1969, he was 21 years old. He had been running for 5 years. He had outrun the FBI, outwitted border controls across 26 countries, and operated in the gaps of an international banking system that simply was not built to catch someone moving as fast as he was. In part 2, the running stops. This is the part of Frank Abagnale's story that does not make it into the posters. The part that is not charming or cinematic or easy to root for. The part where the consequences of 5 years of living as someone else arrive all at once in a small stone cell in the south of France, in conditions that he would later describe as the closest thing to disappearing from the world entirely. It started with a phone call from a woman who recognized his face, and it ended somewhere that nobody who knew Frank Abagnale Jr. in 1964 would ever have imagined him ending up. But not before he tried, one more time, to talk his way out. The woman who ended Frank Abagnale's 5-year run was an Air France flight attendant. He had dated her briefly the previous year, one of the many flight attendants he had met during his time posing as a Pan Am pilot. She had found him charming, attentive, the kind of man who made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. She had also, apparently, paid close attention to his face. In September of 1969, she was passing through an airport, accounts differ on which one, and stopped at a notice board. Interpol had issued a warrant. There was a photograph. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she made a phone call. French police located Frank in Montpellier within days. He was arrested without significant incident. For a man who had built his entire existence on the ability to become someone else at a moment's notice, the arrest was almost anticlimactic. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation, just officers at a door and a man who had run out of identities to wear. He was 21 years old. What happened next was not anticlimactic at all. Frank was taken to a prison in Perpignan in the south of France to await trial. What he found there was a world so far removed from the hotels and airport lounges and first-class cabins of the previous 5 years that it seemed almost designed as a corrective, a deliberate undoing of everything that had come before. The cell was small, stone walls, no window that admitted meaningful light, no mattress, no toilet. The conditions were, by his own detailed account and the accounts of those who later investigated them, genuinely appalling. He lost weight rapidly, eventually close to 80 pounds by some accounts. He could not wash, could not shave, could not cut his hair or his fingernails. Food and water were restricted. For 6 months, Frank Abagnale, the man who had worn a pilot's uniform with the easy authority of someone born to it, who had charmed his way into hospitals and courtrooms and corporate offices, lived in a stone cell in Perpignan with nothing. Nothing at all. When the French trial concluded, 2 days, relatively brief, Frank was sentenced to 1 year in prison. He served 6 months of it in Perpignan before the next question arose. The next question was significant. 26 countries wanted Frank Abagnale extradited to face charges. 26. Italy had filed a request. Spain, Turkey, Germany, Britain, Switzerland, Greece, Denmark, Norway, Egypt, Lebanon, Cyprus. The list went on. Each country had its own checks, its own banks, its own courts waiting to process a young man who had passed through them with someone else's name and someone else's credentials and left a trail of worthless paper behind him. The legal situation was, to put it plainly, the most complicated thing Frank had ever faced, and Frank had faced complicated things. He was extradited to Sweden next. Sweden had been particularly affected by his check fraud. He had defrauded families there, stolen a car, left a pattern of financial damage that Swedish prosecutors had documented carefully. The Swedish prison was a different experience from Perpignan. Marginally better conditions. Approximately 6 months served before the next jurisdiction claimed him. The extradition carousel continued. Country by country, the legal machine processed him. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a judge, whether out of pragmatism or exhaustion at the complexity of the situation, accounts differ, revoked Frank's passport entirely and ordered him deported directly back to the United States. The queue of 24 remaining countries would have to wait. Frank Abagnale landed back on American soil in 1971, 2 years after his arrest in France. Thinner, older in ways that had nothing to do with age, and facing 12 years in a federal prison. The federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia, was nothing like Perpignan. It was modern, well-staffed, and organized with the particular efficiency of American federal corrections. It was also, by every measure, inescapable. Or so the administration believed. Frank arrived in 1971 and was processed as federal prisoner number, well, a number. One among thousands. For the first time in his adult life, there was no alias to retreat to, no identity to construct. His name was on federal documents, his photograph was on federal files, and he was precisely and only Frank William Abagnale Jr., 23 years old, sentenced to 12 years. For most people in that position, the story ends here. The mathematics of the sentence take over. Days become weeks, weeks become months. The outside world continues without you. Frank Abagnale was not most people. He spent his first months in Atlanta studying the facility the way he had once studied Pan Am flight manuals and Louisiana case law and the construction of official government documents. Methodically, patiently, looking for the gap, the rotation, the 47 seconds. He found something better. He found that the prison system, like every large institution he had ever encountered, ran on authority, on the assumption that someone presenting themselves with the right bearing, the right language, the right tone of absolute certainty was exactly who they appeared to be. Frank had been exploiting that assumption since he was 16 years old. In 1971, he approached a prison guard with a story. He was not, he explained, actually an inmate. He was a federal inspector, undercover, placed within the facility to assess conditions and staff conduct as part of a routine federal review. He could not, of course, break cover by producing documentation. The entire value of the inspection depended on it being unannounced. The guard let him walk out. Frank Abagnale walked out of a federal detention facility in Atlanta, Georgia in 1971 using the same tool he had always used. Not a forged document, not a stolen uniform, just words, delivered with the unhesitating confidence of a man who had never once, in his entire adult life, appeared to doubt himself. He was recaptured within days. But he had done it. Again. Even here. Even now.
The escape attempt drew attention. Federal corrections officials were not pleased.
Frank was moved, his security classification was reviewed, and the conditions of his imprisonment tightened considerably. He tried again. The details of his second escape attempt are less thoroughly documented than the first. Frank himself was not always consistent in his accounts of the Atlanta years, a fact that will become significant in Part 3. What is known is that he made at least 2 serious attempts to leave federal custody before his eventual release, and that both attempts demonstrated the same quality that had defined his entire life. Not physical strength, not violence, not anything that required overpowering anyone. The ability to make people believe they were dealing with someone they were not. By the time Frank had been in Atlanta for 3 years, the federal government had reached a calculation of its own. They had a man in custody who was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most gifted fraudsters and document forgers in American history. A man who understood check construction, identity fabrication, institutional security gaps, and the psychology of institutional trust better than almost anyone alive. And they were keeping him in a cell. In 1974, federal prosecutors made Frank Abagnale an offer. He would be released from prison after serving less than 5 years of his 12-year sentence on one condition. He would work for them. Not as an employee exactly, no salary, no official title. He would assist federal authorities in understanding and combating the kinds of fraud he had spent his career perfecting. He would consult, advise, help investigators understand how a man constructs a fake identity, how he exploits institutional trust, where the gaps are in the systems that are supposed to catch people like him. Frank said yes. Of course he did. The transition from federal prisoner to federal consultant was not, it should be said, a smooth one. Frank left prison in 1974 with no money, no professional history he could actually claim, and a federal conviction that appeared on any background check anyone cared to run. He tried several legitimate jobs in the months that followed. Each one ended the same way. Either the conviction surfaced, or the work itself was so far beneath the level of intelligence and improvisation he had operated at for years that he could not sustain the interest required to keep showing up. And then he had an idea. The kind of idea that, in retrospect, was completely inevitable. He walked into a bank. Not to defraud it. He had tried that. He knew how it ended. He walked in and asked to speak to someone in management. When the manager appeared, Frank explained who he was, what he had done, and what he was offering. He would show them, in specific and technical detail, exactly how a man like him had exploited their systems. The deposit slip fraud, the float, the check construction, the ways that a confident person with the right bearing could walk through security gaps that the bank did not even know existed. The manager listened, and then he offered Frank a fee. Word spread. Other banks called, then corporations, then law enforcement agencies, then federal departments who had heard about a former con man who could explain the psychology of fraud from the inside in a way that no textbook had ever managed. Frank Abagnale built a second career on the wreckage of his first one, a consulting business that would eventually make him, by some estimates, considerably wealthier than his years of check fraud had ever managed. He spoke at conferences. He trained FBI agents. He wrote a memoir that became a bestseller. He became, of all the things he had ever been, the most improbable one. Famous. Legitimately, publicly, undeniably famous. Under his real name, for the things he had actually done. It was, by any measure, the longest con he ever ran. And almost nobody questioned it. Almost. Before part 3. If Dead Air Stories is where you come to wind down, subscribe. New parts every week. And drop a comment below. Do you believe Frank Abagnale's story? All of it? Because part 3 is going to ask you that question in a way you are not expecting. See you there. The memoir came out in 1980. Catch Me If You Can. Co-written with Stan Redding, a Houston crime reporter. It told the story of Frank Abagnale's years as an impostor in vivid, specific, entertaining detail. The fake pilot, the fake doctor, the fake lawyer. The checks cashed across 26 countries. The FBI agent who pursued him across continents. The French prison. The escape from Atlanta. It was a remarkable book. Propulsive, funny in places, genuinely astonishing in others. The kind of story that made you put it down occasionally, just to remind yourself it was real. The book sold well. Frank's consulting career accelerated. He became a fixture on the conference circuit, FBI training programs, corporate security briefings. He was charming, articulate, and self-deprecating in exactly the right measure, willing to laugh at his younger self while making clear that the younger self had been genuinely extraordinary. Then, in 2002, Steven Spielberg made the film. Leonardo DiCaprio as Frank, Tom Hanks as the FBI agent. A glossy, warm, deeply entertaining piece of cinema that presented Frank Abagnale's story as one of the great anti-hero adventures of the 20th century. It was nominated for multiple awards. It was seen by tens of millions of people worldwide. It made Frank Abagnale one of the most famous con men in history. And it made him, for the first time, visible enough that people started looking closely. Very closely. Because here is the thing about being famous for the most extraordinary story anyone has ever heard. The more famous you become, the more people start to ask the question that should perhaps have been asked 30 years earlier. Is any of this actually true? The journalists arrived slowly at first. One or two pieces in the mid-2000s questioning specific details. A flight record that did not match his account of a particular journey. A hospital that had no record of a supervising resident by his name in the year he claimed to have worked there. A Louisiana Bar Association that, when pressed, could find no documentation of either his examination results or his subsequent employment. Frank's response to these questions was consistent and practiced. Records from the 1960s were incomplete. Institutions had changed. Files had been lost or destroyed. The people who could confirm the details were dead or unavailable. And besides, he had a federal record. He had served time. The government itself had released him early in exchange for his cooperation. Surely that confirmed the broad truth of what he claimed. It was a reasonable argument. For a while, it held. Then Alan Logan arrived. Logan was an author and investigative researcher who spent several years doing what most journalists had not, going back to primary sources, Not Frank's accounts, not the memoir, not the movie, the actual records. Court documents, prison records, newspaper archives from the 1960s and early 1970s, interviews with people who had actually known Frank Abagnale during the years in question. What Logan found was published in a book called The Greatest Hoax on Earth, and what it contained was not a minor correction to Frank's story. It was a fundamental challenge to almost everything in it. The records showed that Frank Abagnale had a criminal history during the 1960s. Real charges, real convictions, real prison time. He had committed check fraud. He had used false identities. He had run from the law. But the scale, the duration, the specific impersonations, the 26 countries, the years as a Pan Am pilot, the Georgia hospital, the Louisiana bar exam, the FBI chase across 2 continents. Almost none of it, Logan argued, could be verified. And some of it, the record suggested, was simply not true. The actual documented history of Frank Abagnale, as best as public records allow anyone to reconstruct it, looks something like this. He was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in February of 1969, not in France, and not after years of running across Europe. He was charged with theft and forgery. He was convicted in June of that year and sentenced to supervised probation. He fled to Europe shortly after. He was arrested in Montpellier, France in September 1969. He served approximately 4 months in a French prison, not 6. He was extradited to Sweden, where he served approximately 2 months. He was deported back to the United States. In total, Frank Abagnale served roughly 3 years and 4 months in American federal custody. Not 5 years. Not the dramatic arc of the memoir. The Pan Am pilot impersonation, Logan's research suggested, lasted weeks, not years. There is no verified record of a Frank Abagnale working as a supervising medical resident in Georgia. The Louisiana bar exam results, despite repeated attempts to locate them, do not appear in any public record. What seems clear is that Frank Abagnale was a real criminal, a genuinely skilled check forger and identity fraudster who operated across multiple states and countries in the late 1960s. A man who served real prison time and genuinely did go on to build a career advising on fraud prevention. The parts in between, the extraordinary decade of impersonation, the global chase, the cinematic escapes, those are the parts that the evidence does not support. Which raises the most interesting question of all. If Frank Abagnale fabricated or dramatically embellished the story that made him famous, then the greatest con he ever pulled was not the Eiffel Tower, not the pilot's uniform, not the bar exam. It was the book. It was convincing the entire world for 40 years that he was the most extraordinary impostor who ever lived. And if that is true, if the story itself is the con, then you have to ask yourself one more question. Does that make Frank Abagnale less impressive? Or considerably more?
Frank Abagnale Jr. is still alive.
He is in his mid-70s. He has, by any measure, lived a remarkable life, whether the remarkable parts are the ones he says they are, or not. He has spoken at thousands of events. He has trained law enforcement agencies around the world. He has made a great deal of money. He has a family, a legitimate name, a reputation that, even now, even with the questions that surround it, is one of the most extraordinary in the history of American crime, or American storytelling, depending on which version of the story you believe. In part 3, the final part, we are going to go through the evidence properly, not to condemn Frank Abagnale, not to exonerate him, but to look at what we can actually verify, what we cannot, and what it says about us, about all of us, that we wanted so badly to believe in him that we never really asked. Part 3 of The Impostor drops next week on Dead Air Stories. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And leave a comment. Do you think Frank Abagnale is a genius, a fraud, or the most successful storyteller of the 20th century? Because after part 3, I think you are going to have a very specific answer. Dead Air Stories. New parts every week.